Alrighty, welcome back to Reviews with Elaine, because I have opinions. And today's opinions will be about Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell by Susanna Clarke. So, my sister gave me this book, and I'm going to start today's review with her review that she left in a post-it note at the beginning of this book. It reads, "An awesome story. N does not let you down. Has pictures." But my review. Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell is a book about two magicians in an alternative version of Georgian England. In this version of England, magic once abounded, to the point that the northern half of the country was actually ruled by a magician king called the Raven King. Now, the Raven King ruled for 4 centuries and is generally agreed to be the greatest magician in English history. But that was long ago. After the Raven King disappeared, magic started a very sharp decline, to the point that soon spells that had worked for generations just stopped working. The theory and knowledge of magic was very quickly disappearing, largely because a lot of it was not written down. By the time we get to the 1800s, magicians are basically just scholars who study and argue about the history and philosophy of a skill set long lost. Until Mr. Norrell appears. He is a practical magician, and he sets out to restore proper English magic. Though he doesn't seem to actually believe anyone but himself is capable of knowing what that means, and so he spends a large portion of his time repressing what he sees as not proper English magic, rather than, actually promoting what he thinks is. Then appears Jonathan Strange, a magician who will be his pupil, his peer, and his rival. But what they do not realize is that there's a certain danger coming with the return of the practice of English magic. English magic has always been bound up very tightly with fairies, and with the return of fairy magic comes the return of the old dangers of fairies meddling, kidnapping, and plotting against the magicians who use them. And that does not really begin to cover what this book actually is. I really like this book specifically because it felt very unlike any other fantasy novel I've ever read. I thought I was picking up a gaslamp fantasy, and a relatively normal gaslamp fantasy, but this is not Victorian or Edwardian. This is Georgian, and that has a very different flavor. And unlike the Temeraire series, which is Georgian but very much focuses on the war, this is focused on Georgian society. And I was struck almost immediately by how intensely this felt like reading The Life and Opinions of Tristram Shandy, Gentleman by Lawrence Stern. If you've seen my series, the reviews of books I haven't read in years on that book, you know that I love that book. Like Tristram Shandy, I actually wrote part of my senior thesis on that book. And it's because it's a lovely, meandering book. It's a book that exists as a physical representation of the human urge to delay and avoid death. There's something in it that is similar to that moment that you see a lot if you live in the South, and I've heard also the Midwest, where, people are trying to leave, but just end up standing in the doorway chatting for another hour or two. That's a moment of knowing that you are going to go, that you have to go, and sort of just refusing to accept it. Though I would point out that at least in the South, sometimes it's less an actual refusal to accept that you're going as a polite thing of you have to show that you would prefer to stay. But there is something of that weird, meandering tone to the first couple hundreds of pages of this book. It felt like we were meeting people and seeing scenes that were illustrative of themes and not really pertinent to moving the story forward, to the point that it starts to feel like the goal is to not move the story forward. It also has footnotes, which is reminiscent of Tristram Shandy, and the footnotes include really important information, but I'll get to that a little bit later. And the author even made the choice to use archaic spelling and occasional archaic punctuation to recreate the feeling of reading a Georgian book. But it also mimics the semi-scholarly yet flippant tone of Tristram Shandy so thoroughly that honestly, you would be hard-pressed to convince me that Susanna Clarke was not using that book as an inspiration. But the book does start to separate itself from Tristram Shandy's tone as the story gets going, and I think that's largely because the story gets going, and that's a direct contradiction to what Tristram Shandy is about. But I don't think that's a bad thing. We don't need another version of Tristram Shandy that just happens to include magic. And while both books are heavily bound up in a theme of legacy, this book is more about what we do with the legacy left to us than what our legacy we will leave behind will be. But I mentioned that I wanted to talk about footnotes. There is a pretty strong tradition in fantasy nowadays for often humorous footnotes, largely thanks to Sir Terry Pratchett. And I absolutely love a book with footnotes! They can do some really fascinating things! The most common and upfront, obvious thing that footnotes do is they allow an author to include direct exposition and world building without having to artfully hide it behind non-intrusive disguised things. It also, though, lends to an academic tone, and it creates a separation from the main text. So, like, much of what is in footnotes could be in the main text, but it's not. And like in academic writing, that is because what is in footnotes is often extraneous information that the reader may need if they don't know a lot about this field. So it's often definitions of terms or further reading that some people will have already done that reading and not need, but other people are going to need that little bit of extra information. And yeah, some footnotes in fiction work that way too, but often they're actually there to do something more interesting. Sometimes they're used to remind us of what we read earlier, and when you're looking at a book that is around 800 pages, yeah, that can be quite useful. But the thing that I really love with footnotes is when they are used to create two separate narrative voices. So the book's narrator is never defined. Like, we do not know who narrates this book. For a while I thought it might be Mr. Segundus, but there are enough random hits here and there that I know it was not him. And my inclination in the end is to think that it is a, like, future to this time period historian. The point is, this book draws attention to its narrator. Its anonymous narrator. Most books, like, that are written in third person, omniscient, or even third person limited, you're not really thinking about who is telling the story. But this one you are, and a lot of that is because of the footnotes. Now, the footnotes in this book, the majority of the text in this book is very clearly third-person omniscient or third-person limited, sometimes focusing on Mr. Norrell, sometimes focusing on Jonathan Strange, or 7 million other characters. But the footnotes are very clearly in a separate tone of voice. They are more scholarly, often citing sources, and telling us things that the narrator doesn't know, and debating things that, like, scholars currently talk about. But overall, the footnotes begin to feel very much like they are written by someone else, which objectively is often true in scholarly works. Often there are footnotes written by, like, future historians, and that sort of feels like what's going on here. But that allows the author to have two voices to play with, sometimes contradicting each other, sometimes cutting the tension of a scene. Like, there are scenes where there's an argument happening and yet there's a footnote on, like, every line, so you have to keep undercutting the tension to go read what the hell they're talking about. But there's also moments where they're used to build tension, like telling us something is important that we didn't otherwise know was important, or, like, pointing out that this is a bigger strife. And it creates a really interesting separation. And also, the footnotes in this book are used for foreshadowing. Having the foreshadowing be in the footnotes is a really sort of magical thing, because foreshadowing automatically, it sort of sets you up to feel like you know something special, that you know something that people on the page do not know. You know something that people in the scene cannot know. And footnotes take this a step further, because the act of reading down at the bottom of the page sort of makes it feel like you're discovering something separate, something secret. So it increases that vibe of, like, I know something that no one else knows. But also, Jonathan Strange is introduced in a footnote, which is ballsy as hell, because I know good and well there's some people out there who did not bother reading the footnotes here. And, like, the very first mention of Jonathan Strange is in a footnote. The first sign that he is eventually going to disagree morally and philosophically with Mr. Norrell appears in a footnote. Even the first signs of his character and personality appear in footnotes. And I think partially that was out of necessity, because the actual character does not appear for the first 250 pages, which is a problem, because he's the main character. Like, yes, There are two titular characters here, but Jonathan Strange is the one who gets more space on the page. He has the greater arc of growth. He is the far more active of the two main characters, which is a bit ironic because when they're introduced, the main character traits here is that Mr. Norrell is super driven to his purpose, whereas Strange becomes a magician because he can't settle on any other occupation. But in the end, Strange is the lead. And I think that's all telegraphed by the names. Yes, of course, their names appear on the page, and literally on the cover, Jonathan Strange is above Mr. Norrell, but also we get his full name here, whereas we get Mr. Norrell. And throughout the text, yes, there are characters that call him Jonathan Strange, the narration often calls him Jonathan Strange, whereas Mr. Norrell is always Mr. Norrell. Like, I don't think we even find out his name is Gilbert until over halfway through the book, and we find that out from Jonathan Strange. And I'm pretty sure Jonathan Strange is the only one who ever refers to him as Gilbert. But there's also just something a bit more interesting going on with names here, other than just a sign of who we should be focusing on. Like, for example, the Raven King is referred to almost exclusively as the Raven King for the first half of the book. And then suddenly, out of the blue, we find out that his name is actually John Usglass. And it's not one of those situations where it's like, John Usglass, the Raven King, introducing new information. No, we're dropped the name John Usglass, and you have to, through, like, you know, context clues, figure out that that is the Raven King. And the transition from a title to a name does a very important thing. It makes him more human, it gives him a lot more reality, and makes him less of a myth. And then for the most of the rest of the book, he is referred almost exclusively to as John Usglass. And then we find out that's not actually his name, and it's a big plot point that it's not his name. So this character has gone from being myth to human to myth. But it's not the only interesting thing she does with names. There's also Stephen Black, who has a name, but then he doesn't have a name, and it's also a plot point. And then there's Dr. Graystill, who, when we find out his first name, it turns out to be a big context clue sign of what his character is going to be doing, because yeah, it's pertinent, though less obviously so. And this is not just a simple matter of like names telling us who the people are, like malapropism is a common name for a character in plays from this era, but also like umbrage is a word that means like taking offense, but is also the name of Professor Umbridge. No, this is more interesting because of the way the author is using it. We're not told when we're introduced to Dr. Graystill that his name is Lancelot. He's been here for a while before it's just dropped onto the page at random. And that really, it gives the reader a different vibe, a different sensation. But at this point, this has devolved into basically just literary analysis, not a review, which is not something I was trying to do. But I think it's because this book is really good. It's like I couldn't help myself from doing a little bit of literary analysis on Moby Dick, because there's just so much there to delve into. And yeah, on the surface, this is a fun, enjoyable, adventurous fantasy novel. But it's also a good book. There's quality writing. It does that great thing where there are these themes and deep meanings, but they are not there at the cost of the story. Also, its protagonists are very much not the common protagonist you see in fantasy. Like, Strange is a bit closer because he's described as young, attractive, male, and his main flaws are being distractible and a little bit arrogant. But Mr. Norrell, really not a protagonist you see in a lot of fantasy. He's described as being the type of man that was born old. He's a coward. He is rather unlikable. He's a book hoarder. But it's not even just that. There are so many characters in this book, and some of them are a little bit more traditional fantasy leads, and some of them are a little bit less so. And just the sheer number of characters in the beginning, introducing them, is sort of what also helped get that Tristram Shandy-ish vibe, because that book introduces a buttload of characters, and then they sort of go nowhere. Whereas in this book, yeah, almost all of them get wrapped up in the end. Almost all of them have a, like, valid, cohesive character arc with a conclusion, which is hella impressive considering how many of them there are. But also, this book has my favorite kind of ending. The kind that implies there are more adventures just around the corner, that this is not the end, and yet there is still enough resolution that I feel comfortable letting those characters go out and have their adventures without me. if Susanna Clarke ever does get around to writing a sequel to this book, which I'm not sure she will, because I'm not sure this book feels like it actually has to have one, but if she does, I will read it in a flash. If she doesn't, I'm fine with that. But I just want to share one particular beautiful moment in this book with you. So after mentioning in my Temeraire reviews that I had pretty much never read any fantasy set during the Napoleonic War, here's another one. But Temeraire is very much about the war, whereas this book, the war is a much less important part. But one of the major developments in Doctor Strange, in Jonathan Strange's personality and his relationship with Mr. Norrell, comes when he goes off to war. He fights as the Duke of Wellington's magician. And much of this time is written in the same playful, flippant tone that reminded me so strongly of Tristram Shandy. But then there's a moment. There's one moment where the war suddenly becomes very serious. And I don't want to spoil anything for you, but there's a battle that gets very violent and very rough, and it gets bad. And afterwards, Jonathan Strange is invited to eat at the dining table with the Duke of Wellington and all his friends, and all the retina, and all the important generals. And of the dozens of people that Wellington invited, 3 arrive. And everyone else is dead. And it's a beautiful moment of seeing survivors' guilt and this power. And I don't know if I was just already emotional when I was reading it or what, but I actually paused to cry in that moment. And the moment's also important in the book in general. To me, at least, that is the turning point where it goes from a meandering exploration of the frivolity of human endeavor into a book that has a strong story that is progressing forward. And I think that is also perfectly timed because from the very beginning, we are aware that the magicians have an enemy, but they are not aware of it. And therefore, it feels like they're doing nothing. And there are many points that I found myself looking at the page being like, oh my god, pay attention, do something. And even though they continue to be unaware of a lot of what's going on, this is the point where they do start to do things. The progression of the story starts to actually have a conflict between this enemy and them that is a direct conflict. And we needed that transition. And also, because of the way the transition is marked out, this is also the turning point where Strange starts to see that he's not going to be able to be, like, you know, Norrell's student forever. And he's galling under Norrell's constant insistence that they be slow and careful, which is also very similar to the feelings we're feeling of galling under the, like, okay, stop just meandering, do the story now. And that mirroring of two emotions, that really puts us right into Jonathan Strange's mind, which is another reason that he becomes the main character. Overall, I would say I love this book. I know that Clarke has another book that won a buttload of awards and that everyone was talking about, and I never bought it because, frankly, the description just didn't sound like something I was super interested in. But after reading Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell, I am super excited to get Piranesi as well. Because if it's anything like this one, it will be an odd, stylistic, and fascinating book.